Welcome to what promises to be the angriest night of the year. And thanks not for going to Lady Gaga, coming here instead. I've no idea why the museum asked me to chair this session of the 7 Deadly Sins series about wrath, other than that I lost my temper with them and threatened grievous bodily harm if they didn't. So typecast again. Wrath. Or wrath. That's one of the things we'll decide today, but some of us are going to say wrath and some will say wrath for obvious reasons. But whichever way you say it, and should we maybe just call it anger? It's something we all experience, arguably causes many of the problems that we experience in our society and in the world in general. From simple tantrums, any of you with children will know that, all the way up to conflicts between nation states, the role of anger and all its component elements, such as resentment and fear and intolerance and aggression. It's unavoidably part of what it means to be human. And like so many emotions, of course, we spend a lot less time analysing it than we do experiencing and probably lamenting it. And yes, we do hear a lot about anger management. Or even that you can channel your anger to do good. But the nature and origins of anger seem to me often to be glossed over in our haste to condemn or to judge. So what, for instance, is the evolutionary usefulness of anger? What biochemical processes trigger it? How well can we truly learn to control it? Can we really use our anger in a positive sense? And what of righteous anger? Is it really better than the other kind? Are there cultural differences in the way people feel or express anger? And in New Zealand, are we a particularly angry society? And if so, what about? Are humans becoming less angry or more angry? That is to say, are we becoming more or less violent over time? And what of the inverse, arguably, of anger? How many buckets of laughter, perhaps, does it take to extinguish a raging fire or a fiery rage, as the case may be? Now, we will take questions from the floor later in the session, but for now I'd like to introduce 3 people with their own unique perspectives on these issues. In no particular order, fresh from the amazing Songs from the Inside series on Māori television, which looked at the healing and restorative power of music in prison, musician and songwriter who will be performing later this evening, Ruia Aperahama. Senior lecturer at the School of Population Health at Auckland University and co-director of the New Zealand Family Violence Clearinghouse, and a leading expert on and writer on the causes and solutions to domestic violence, Dr. Janet Fanslow. And finally, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Auckland, author of Pieces of Mind, 21 Short Walks Around the Human Brain. You might say someone with the mind very much on his mind, Michael Corballis. Welcome to our panel. I am interested in this slightly paradoxical idea of anger being positive, because I'm not sure that, for the sake of argument, that is really anger. I mean, we talk about channeling our anger for good. What are we really doing? I mean, because rage helps, I guess, to some extent, but how do you focus something as uncontrollable as anger as an emotion? Anyone?
Well, I think it was Aristotle who said, well, being angry is easy. Anybody can be angry, but being angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, and for the right purpose, and in the right way, that's the part that's not easy. So there's a lot of pieces that go into figuring out how you're going to direct that. And I think some of the things that Ruia was talking about is, that oftentimes anger is that bit where you're not actually feeling good in yourself, and that you may lash out at other people because of a situation that's going on. But if it could actually be because you're angry at yourself, where you just are not coming from a good place yourself. And so part of that righteous anger is about where do you direct it, who has the power to make a difference. How can you get that message to people in the right way? So at the moment we have a situation around, where university students are angry around changes in, to the student allowance, and so they're trying to protest. They're trying to do peaceful protests about making this, this point of view heard, and other people are responding to them in
angry ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically disparaging them as spoilt toddlers, throwing their toys around.
Yeah. Which is always interesting, given that the people who are making the decisions now probably went through under situations where they got their university paid for, didn't they? In old bursary schemes?
Bottle fed.
I think there's a biological point to make here, which is that we are biologically disposed to anger. I mean, we're a very predatory, violent species, probably the most predatory species there's ever been, because we've destroyed the planet, we kill animals, we kill each other, and so forth. So there is this sort of subcortical thing about anger, that it's in all of us. But we're also blessed with a cerebral cortex, which is that great lump of brain you've got there, that's over the top of the subcortical sort of emotional processes. And therein lies the possibility of negating anger or directing it. So I think the way the brain is put together has a lot to do with how anger is expressed. And that in turn, of course, depends on society, I think.
Let's stay with that for a second. What do we know? And I know you're not specifically an expert in this, about the neurological origins, causes of emotion, specifically anger. What do we know is happening?
Well, I don't know much about the neurochemistry of it, but we know which parts of the brain have to do with anger, and it's mostly subcortical, although anger can be directed cortically to the subcortical, to the limbic system of the brain.
So that's our reptile brain.
The reptile brain, exactly, that's it. So that's where anger comes from, but we do have the capacity, I think, to control it.
So it has an evolutionary function. It was useful. It was adaptive.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you need anger if you're going to defend yourself, I think, as one sort of strategy. But of course, we also use it to be predators in the past anyway. We kill animals.
It's part of the fight or flight mechanism.
Exactly. So it's involved at both ends of it, I think.
And that malfunctions in human beings quite a lot in many other ways, doesn't it? The kind of hormones and chemicals that race through our system when we're stressed, depressed, anxious,
drunk,
angry, drunk.
I mean, there's the sort of chemical side of it, if you like, that kind of prevents the cortical control, removes it, so that more emotional unleashes stuff. Yeah,
we should have had more to drink before we came on stage.
We should have.
Yeah.
Are we not unleashing enough?
Do you think? I want all of you to answer this however you want. Do you think New Zealand is a particularly angry society? Either looking at it through the prism of the violence that we experience, which is obviously too much. Are we angry? And if we're angry, what are we angry about? Janet?
I wouldn't have thought New Zealand was a particularly angry society on the whole. Yes, rates of violence are too high, and I consider quote you chapter and verse on numbers on those, so it's not that we don't have a problem, but I don't think anger is the problem. I think there's a whole lot of issues around that anger sometimes gets confused with power, and it's about power relationships with that. But I think New Zealand as a country actually has an awful lot going for it, and on a world scale, I think we sometimes forget how affluent and educated and, generally successful we are, and what a wonderful place we get to live in. So I think that, on the whole, New Zealanders aren't probably particularly angry, nor do they have cause to be. I guess the caution around that, though, is that, the good stuff that we have is only here if we work to keep it, and that there are things like the widening gap between rich and poor. There are things around, changes in education or some, and there are whole issues around colonization and rights of Indigenous people that I think we need to still work to address, because I think unless we get those inequalities sorted, then we will still have root causes for real anger and righteous anger.
Michael?
I agree entirely with Janet, actually. I don't think we're particularly angry. I think there is much more obvious anger in other countries right now, if you look around. If any of you saw that Nazi salute, the football crowd in Ukraine, was it, or Poland?
Poland or the Ukraine,
and
yes.
I think the world out there is much more full of anger than we see here.
Yeah.
The trouble with saying that, of course, is it tends to sound complacent. Which I don't want to sound, but I think we are a remarkably peaceful society, myself.
Yeah.
Ruia?
Well, the first thing comes to my mind is dang, 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 dang. Once were warriors. And, while that might be stereotypical, once were warriors for me. And I've got to tell you a story. When I went, there were people in my family and my relations, when they went to see that movie, were very uncomfortable and walked out because it was too close to the truth. And for me, at least, Once Were Warriors, and the title, Once Were Warriors, is pretty significant in terms of New Zealand and your question. The Once Were Warriors phenomenon, I think, and I'm sure everybody all seen the movie, left a deep impression. Cook me some eggs, and just that whole anger in the pub. Getting back to your question about the alcohol, that depicts, a scenario that depicts what happens with anger and alcohol when you see Jake the Muss coming in and just smashing and doing damage, and with his wife Bess and the kids, and what they see growing up, the effects that had, and the suicide with the daughter, those are hard impacting realities that I know and I've grown up and seen in my life. And it's unfortunate, well, not unfortunate, there's a number of reasons, but being in the prison, over 75% are Māori, the high statistics of brutal violence against our families is depicted and perceived in media, that Māori are children bashers and wife bashers. And I have to not be ashamed of it, but look at it directly in the face and try and dig underneath what's happening. And what I see is a lot of pain, and there needs to be healing that needs to happen. What we do with that and how we do with that, well, I think at the end, when the family are on the red Corolla car, all singing in that whole movie just for 3 minutes together, creating a happy moment, the key is to try and stay in it and sit in it. Otherwise, we keep relapsing, because for some people, anger is normal. For some people, anger is a drug. For some people, anger is a way of living, and to live outside of anger is frightening for them.
Sport has been mentioned, and New Zealand is a particularly sport-focused country. Coming from a British background, sports like soccer come with a high level of abuse and violence. And I've seen reports recently of referees and coaches in New Zealand being abused and being abusive. How do we get the balance right between being competitive and being angry?
Who'd like to take that one? I was on the receiving end of some sideline rage a couple of weekends ago at my son's football match, so I'll disqualify myself from that one.
I think there's something to be said for sublimation through sports, but it can, of course, get out of hand. But
when you say sublimation, you mean sort of
putting your anger into things that are not killing people. Well, not quite killing people. Like rugby, for example, or soccer, or whatever. So I think there is a positive side to all this, but certainly it sort of picks up some of the nasty nationalism and taking sides that has its downside too. But on the whole, I think it's things that sublimate our anger. I mean, even music, for example, or literature or art have this effect. Rugby's perhaps a slightly more extreme example.
Well, that reminds me of, you go to games and you're talking about perhaps the violence between those who are playing on the field, but have you seen the anger and violence on the sidelines with mum and dad and the families?
That's exactly what I was talking about. Yes, I know.
But I think it's partly about your definition of what's a good game, isn't it? Because if you decide that it's only a good game if you've won, then you care about it, and to the point that all behavior is acceptable if it's not about winning. But if a good game is everybody's gone out there and had a decent go, they've played fair, they've had fun, then your notions of what you're trying to achieve change. And so it's about really keeping your eye on what the real prize is.
Well, essentially it's about being a grown-up, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that too.
We have a question. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, I think we're not bad, actually, at this. I was telling these people before, but I took a train recently in Frankfurt in Germany, the Underground, and I happened to be in the train when a football crowd got on after the game, and I thought I was going to die.
Well, obviously you didn't, so that was just xenophobia, wasn't it? They turned out to be friendly football crowd.
I've just wounded.
Question over here.
Okay, I'll stand up. Tēnā rā koe ke Ruia, nau I whakarmaro mai kia mātou te whānui o tēnei mea kia nei te riri. Taitu kia koutou o te e noho mai rā. I just want to ask you, I lived in the Middle East for a few years, and one of the things I witnessed there was what I could only describe as ritual anger, where people were in a situation where you would think that things would erupt into mayhem, but in fact people maintain their mana by being able to express anger in quite extreme ways without it exploding into violence. And I just wondered if you had any comment on that aspect of anger. Kia ora.
I think that's a good example in relation to the question by the lady here. Where do you find the balance? And I think it's healthy to show all of our emotions, anger being one of them as well. The question is, as you were saying about rituals, whether it's the soccer, football, rugby, or those rituals of haka, as long as the line of hurt, of hurting somebody else, physically, mentally, isn't crossed that line. So the dance is like a flame. It's like us when we can, as children, and we can kind of like almost touch the flame but not touch it. So I think it's important, and finding that balance, rituals help us.
I'm going to have to wrap it up now because we're going to run out of time. I'd love to take more questions, but at least there's food for thought. I haven't really got much to add, to be honest, other than to quote Gough Whitlam, who famously said, "Maintain the rage," but he meant it in a positive way. I'd like to thank you very much for coming and for your energy, and particularly like to thank our panellists. Thank you and good night.